Albuquerque, New Mexico. The streets of the Riverside neighborhood. A red Chevrolet Monte Carlo with vanity plates that read "The K-Pen" rolled through the avenues where the desperate came to buy their escape. Behind the wheel sat Jesse Bruce Pinkman, a 24-year-old dealer who had built a reputation that mattered in the shadows of the city. They called him Cap'n Cook. The name carried weight in the circles where weight was currency. Jesse had what most small-time dealers never achieved. He had a network. His friends Brandon Mayhew, known as Badger, and Skinny Pete moved product across the city with an efficiency that came from years of friendship and shared risk. Christian Ortega, called Combo, handled the tougher neighborhoods where trust was measured in scars and survival. Together, they formed a distribution system that generated consistent cash and avoided the kind of attention that ended careers in handcuffs or body bags. The product Jesse cooked had a signature: chili powder, a red tint that marked his methamphetamine as distinct in a market flooded with generic crystal. It was not the purest on the streets, it was not the most potent, but it was his, and in the economy of the drug trade, brand recognition meant customers returned. Jesse understood the fundamentals of his business: supply, demand, territory, reputation. He had been cooking and dealing since his expulsion from his family home, where his parents chose respectability over their eldest son. At 24, Jesse Pinkman believed he understood the game. He knew how to avoid the law. He knew how to handle competition. He knew how to survive in a world where most dealers either ended up imprisoned or eliminated. He had confidence born from experience, street intelligence, practical knowledge earned through years of navigating a dangerous trade. What Jesse did not know was that a dying chemistry teacher would soon teach him that intelligence came in forms he had never considered. The partnership began with a threat, not an invitation. Walter Hartwell White arrived at Jesse Pinkman's residence on a September evening in 2008, carrying the desperation of a man who had received a terminal diagnosis 3 weeks prior: lung cancer, inoperable. The doctors had given him estimates measured in months, not years. Walt needed money for his family's future, and he needed it quickly. He had identified Jesse as his entry point into the methamphetamine trade after witnessing the young dealer escape through a bedroom window during a Drug Enforcement Administration raid. The connection was simple. Jesse had been a student in Walt's chemistry class at J.P. Wynne High School years earlier, a mediocre pupil who had barely passed and ultimately dropped out. When Walt approached Jesse with the proposal to manufacture methamphetamine together, Jesse's response was immediate and dismissive. The laughter came first, the kind of incredulous reaction reserved for absurd suggestions. A high school chemistry teacher, 50 years old, dying of cancer, proposing to enter the crystal meth business. Jesse saw a man who represented everything he had rejected: authority, rules, the conventional life that led nowhere but a modest salary and a car wash job on weekends. Walt stood in Jesse's house as a symbol of failure, not opportunity. Jesse's exact words carried the contempt he felt. "You want to cook crystal meth? You and me?" The disbelief was genuine. High school was a distant memory, and Walt's attempts to invoke that former teacher-student relationship met with swift rejection. Jesse made his position clear. Whatever authority Walt had once held in a classroom had no currency in the world Jesse inhabited. The streets operated on different principles. Respect came from reputation, not credentials. Power came from product and connections, not chemistry degrees. From Jesse's perspective, the situation was transparent. Walt was desperate, weak, afraid. A man who had spent his entire life following society's rules and discovered those rules had left him unprepared for mortality. Jesse had dealt with desperate people before. They made mistakes, they took unnecessary risks, they attracted attention. The last thing Jesse needed was a partner who would compromise his operation through incompetence or panic. Walt's proposal seemed less like a business opportunity and more like a liability. The chemistry teacher's appearance reinforced Jesse's assessment. Khaki pants, a modest button-down shirt, glasses that suggested hours spent reading rather than surviving. Walt had no criminal experience, no connections to distributors, no understanding of the violence that underscored every transaction in the drug trade. He was a civilian attempting to enter a war zone armed with nothing but knowledge from textbooks. Jesse had seen others like him before, amateurs who believed intelligence alone could compensate for inexperience. They rarely lasted long. What Jesse failed to recognize was the leverage Walt possessed. The chemistry teacher had witnessed Jesse's escape from the DEA raid. He knew Jesse's identity. He knew Jesse's operation. And Walt had no qualms about using that information as a weapon. The partnership, Jesse mocked, would begin not from mutual respect but from coercion. Walt delivered his ultimatum with a simplicity that revealed how quickly a desperate man abandons conventional morality. "Cook with me, or I turn you in to the authorities." Jesse agreed because he had no choice. But in that moment, standing in his own home, forced into partnership with a dying teacher, Jesse Pinkman believed he maintained the advantage. He knew the business. Walt knew chemistry. The relationship seemed clear. Jesse would handle the real work while Walt provided technical expertise. The street-smart dealer and the book-smart teacher. Jesse had no doubt which role carried more value. He would soon learn that intelligence came in forms more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The first months of their partnership revealed patterns that Walter White observed with the methodical attention he had once applied to chemical reactions. Jesse Pinkman operated on emotion. Every decision, every response, every moment of crisis was filtered through feelings rather than logic. Walt watched, he catalogued, he learned. Jesse craved approval in a way that revealed the wound at his center. His parents had expelled him from the family home after discovering his drug use. His younger brother Jake received the affection and support that Jesse had lost. The rejection had created a hunger in Jesse that he attempted to fill through reputation on the streets. Cap'n Cook. The nickname and the small-time success provided temporary validation, but Walt recognized the emptiness underneath. Jesse wanted someone to acknowledge his worth, to see potential where others saw only a burnout and a dropout. The teacher-student dynamic had never truly ended. When Walt explained chemistry, Jesse listened with an attention he had never demonstrated in the classroom years earlier. When Walt corrected Jesse's cooking methods, Jesse bristled but ultimately complied. The pattern was consistent. Jesse would resist, argue, defend his approach, then he would defer to Walt's expertise. The older man's approval, even when delivered in small measures, visibly affected Jesse. A simple acknowledgement that the product was acceptable would change Jesse's entire demeanor. Walt filed this information away for future use. Jesse's loyalty was absolute once it was earned. His friends Badger, Skinny Pete, and Combo received unwavering support despite their frequent mistakes and limited capabilities. When Jesse committed to a person, he committed completely. Walt observed how Jesse defended these relationships even when they cost him money or safety. This loyalty was both Jesse's strength and his vulnerability. A man who would sacrifice for those he cared about could be controlled through threats to those same people. The guilt was another lever Walt identified. Jesse carried remorse for his actions in a way that Walt found increasingly foreign to his own experience. When their first cook resulted in the death of Emilio Koyama, Jesse was visibly shaken. When they were forced to deal with Crazy 8, Jesse struggled with the moral weight of the decision. Walt watched Jesse wrestle with conscience and recognized this as exploitable weakness. A man haunted by guilt could be manipulated through careful application of additional guilt or through offers of redemption. Jesse's need for a father figure emerged clearly through their interactions. Jesse's own father had rejected him. His relationship with authority was complicated by both resentment and a desire for guidance. Walt occupied a space that Jesse's psychology had prepared for him. The teacher, the older man, the person with answers. Jesse resisted this dynamic consciously. but his behavior revealed the truth. He sought Walt's approval. He wanted Walt's respect. He needed someone to believe in his potential. Walt began to adjust his approach based on these observations. He alternated between criticism and minimal praise, creating uncertainty that kept Jesse seeking approval. He positioned himself as the only person who truly understood Jesse's capabilities. He isolated Jesse from other influences by questioning their competence or loyalty. Each interaction was calculated to deepen Jesse's dependence on Walt's validation. Jesse noticed none of this. He saw a partnership between a street dealer and a chemist. He believed the relationship was transactional, bounded by their shared criminal enterprise. He did not recognize that Walt was constructing a psychological architecture that would allow for complete control. The teacher was studying his student far more carefully than he ever had in a classroom, and this time, Walt intended to ensure that the lessons would be permanent. Jane Margolis entered Jesse Pinkman's life in the spring of 2009 as his landlord and neighbor. She was a tattoo artist with a sharp wit and a history of substance problems she had overcome through 18 months of sobriety. The relationship that developed between Jane and Jesse was genuine in ways that threatened everything Walter White had constructed. Jane saw Jesse not as a subordinate or a tool, but as a person worthy of love and a future beyond the drug trade. She encouraged him to claim his independence. She convinced him that he deserved the money Walt was withholding. She made Jesse believe in possibilities that did not include Walter White. Walt recognized the threat immediately. Jane was pulling Jesse away from his orbit. She was providing the approval and validation that Walt had carefully rationed to maintain control. Worse, Jane knew about their operation. She had leverage. When Jesse's share of their profits reached $480,000, Walt refused to deliver the money, citing Jesse's drug use as justification. He claimed he was protecting Jesse from himself. The truth was simpler. Walt was protecting his control. Jane responded by calling Walt's home telephone, bypassing his carefully maintained boundaries between his criminal life and his family. She delivered an ultimatum that combined threat with certainty. Give Jesse his money, or she would expose Walt's drug manufacturing to the authorities. She knew Walt's brother-in-law worked for the Drug Enforcement Administration. She understood exactly how much damage she could inflict. For the first time in their partnership, Walt faced someone willing to destroy him to protect Jesse. Walt delivered the money, $480,000 in a duffel bag, handed over to Jesse and Jane in their apartment. He watched them celebrate, watched them plan their escape to New Zealand, watched Jane promise Jesse a future far from Albuquerque and far from Walter White. Then Walt left, believing he had lost his leverage over Jesse permanently. But that night, Walt returned to Jesse's apartment. He had come to make one final attempt to reason with Jesse, to reassert control through words. What he found instead was opportunity delivered by chance and chemistry. Jesse and Jane lay unconscious in bed, deep in a substance-induced sleep. Walt entered the bedroom, attempting to wake Jesse, to pull him back from the edge he believed Jesse was approaching. As Walt shook Jesse's shoulder, the motion transferred through the mattress. Jane rolled from her side onto her back. Then she began to choke. Vomit rose from her throat and her airway closed. The sound was distinct, desperate. Walt's first instinct was to help. He moved toward Jane, his hands reaching to turn her onto her side, to clear the obstruction, to save her life. Then Walt stopped. His hands froze inches from Jane's body. His mind processed the situation with the same analytical clarity he applied to chemical formulas. Jane alive meant Jesse leaving. Jane alive meant continued threats. Jane alive meant loss of control. Jane dead meant Jesse would need support. Jane dead meant the blackmail ended. Jane dead meant Walt could position himself as Jesse's only ally in grief. Walter White made his choice in the span of seconds. He stepped back. He covered his mouth with his hand. He watched Jane Margolis choke to death on her own vomit while Jesse Pinkman slept beside her, unaware that the person he trusted most was allowing the person he loved most to die. Walt's face showed emotion. Tears fell, but the tears were not enough to change his decision. When Jane's breathing stopped, Walt left the apartment silently. Jesse would wake to find his girlfriend dead and would never know that his partner, his teacher, his trusted ally had watched it happen and chosen not to intervene. Jane's death was only the beginning of Walter White's campaign to own Jesse Pinkman's soul. The devastation it created served Walt's purposes perfectly. Jesse spiraled into grief and substance abuse, blaming himself for Jane's death, never suspecting that Walt had stood in that bedroom and made a choice. Walt became Jesse's support system through the trauma, the only person Jesse believed understood his pain. The manipulation was invisible, which made it complete. But by the 4th season, Jesse had begun to slip from Walt's control again. Gustavo Fring, the businessman who oversaw their methamphetamine operation, recognized Jesse's potential and started cultivating a direct relationship with him. Jesse responded to Gus's respect and professionalism. He started to believe he could succeed without Walt. He started to question whether Walt had ever truly valued him as a partner rather than as a tool. The distance between them grew, and Walt recognized he was losing the person he needed most to maintain his empire. Walt's solution was unthinkable. Brock Cantillo was 6 years old, the son of Andrea Cantillo, the woman Jesse had come to care for deeply. Jesse loved that child. He played video games with Brock. He wanted to be a positive presence in his life. Brock represented the possibility of redemption, of being someone better than the criminal Jesse had become. Walt identified this love as the pressure point that could shatter Jesse's growing independence. In late 2010, Walt obtained berries from a lily-of-the-valley plant he cultivated in his backyard. The plant was toxic, but not immediately lethal. Walt needed Brock sick, not dead. He needed Jesse terrified, but not permanently traumatized in ways that would break their partnership beyond repair. Through methods that were never directly witnessed but were later confirmed, Walt poisoned Brock's lunch at school. The child became violently ill and was rushed to the hospital, where doctors initially suspected ricin poisoning. Walt had prepared for this. He had his lawyer's bodyguard, Huel Babineau, steal a ricin cigarette from Jesse's pocket during a routine pat-down. When Brock fell ill, Jesse immediately suspected the ricin. He believed he had somehow caused the poisoning through his own carelessness. Then Walt convinced Jesse that Gustavo Fring must have orchestrated the poisoning, using Brock to manipulate Jesse against Walt. The lie was sophisticated, layered, supported by circumstantial details that made it believable. Jesse accepted Walt's version of events because he desperately wanted to believe that Walt had not harmed a child. The alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. Jesse helped Walt eliminate Gus Fring, believing they were avenging a threat against Brock. When doctors later revealed that Brock had been poisoned with lily of the valley rather than ricin, Walt suggested the child must have found the berries naturally. Jesse wanted to believe this explanation. He needed to believe it. So he did, for an entire year, until evidence made denial impossible. The truth emerged in the 5th season when Jesse realized that Huel had pickpocketed the ricin cigarette. The same technique had been used to steal his substance from him recently. The connections formed in Jesse's mind like a chemical reaction reaching completion. Walt had poisoned Brock. Walt had manipulated him into helping eliminate Gus. Walt had used a 6-year-old child as a weapon. Every assumption Jesse had made about Walt's limits, about the boundaries Walt would not cross, shattered in that moment of realization. Jesse's response was fury that bordered on violence. He attempted to burn down Walt's house, to destroy everything Walt had built, to make him pay for the cruelty he had inflicted on an innocent child. But Walt was always 3 moves ahead. He called his neo-Nazi contacts, men he had used to eliminate witnesses in prison. He ordered them to eliminate Jesse. The partnership that had begun with a threat was ending with a contract for execution. The destruction of Jesse Pinkman was methodical and complete. After the failed attempt to burn Walt's house, Jesse was intercepted by Hank Schrader, Walt's brother-in-law and a Drug Enforcement Administration agent who had finally discovered Walt's true identity. Hank convinced Jesse to cooperate, to help bring down the man who had destroyed his life. For a brief moment, Jesse believed he might find redemption through helping the law. That hope lasted until the desert. In the barren landscape outside Albuquerque, Hank and his partner Stephen Gomez attempted to arrest Walter White. But Walt had called Jack Welker's gang, the same neo-Nazis he had once hired to eliminate witnesses. The shootout was brief and devastating. Gomez died first. Hank died begging for his life while Walt screamed for Jack to stop. Jesse watched from inside a vehicle, helpless, as the last person trying to protect him was executed in front of Walt's eyes. Then Jack's nephew, Todd Alquist, dragged Jesse from the car. Walt looked at Jesse with an expression that contained 5 years of accumulated resentment. The words Walt spoke in that desert were chosen to inflict maximum damage. Walt revealed that he had watched Jane die. He had been there in the apartment. He could have saved her. He chose not to. The information detonated in Jesse's mind like an explosive. Every assumption about Jane's death, every moment of guilt Jesse had carried, every nightmare he had suffered was recontextualized in an instant. Walt had killed her through inaction. Walt had comforted Jesse through grief that Walt himself had caused. Jack's gang took Jesse as a prisoner. They chained him in a concrete cell dug into the ground at their compound. They forced him to cook methamphetamine in a laboratory they had constructed, threatening him with execution if the quality fell below their standards. Todd hung a photograph in the lab where Jesse worked. The image showed Andrea Cantillo and her son, Brock. The message was clear: cooperate or they suffer. Jesse attempted escape once. He managed to break free from the compound and reach a fence before being recaptured. Todd's response was to teach Jesse a lesson about the cost of disobedience. He drove Jesse to Andrea's house in the evening. Andrea answered the door, confused and happy to see Jesse. She stepped onto the porch. Todd removed a pistol from his jacket and shot Andrea in the back of the head, while Jesse screamed from the vehicle. She collapsed on the porch of the home Jesse's money had provided, dying instantly while her son remained inside, unaware that his mother's life had just ended. Todd turned to Jesse and explained the new reality with calm certainty. If Jesse tried to escape again, Brock would be next. The 6-year-old child would be eliminated as punishment for Jesse's disobedience. Jesse had no response. He had nothing left to bargain with. No leverage, no hope, no future beyond the concrete cell and the laboratory where he cooked methamphetamine for the men who had taken everything from him. The psychological destruction was total. Jesse had entered the drug trade believing he understood the game, believing his street intelligence would protect him. Instead, he had encountered something far more dangerous than the violence he anticipated. He had met a man who weaponized trust, who turned love into vulnerability, who used Jesse's own capacity for loyalty and affection as instruments of control. Walt had not simply defeated Jesse. He had systematically dismantled every aspect of Jesse's identity, every relationship he valued, every hope for redemption or escape. Jesse's words from years earlier, spoken in a hospital bed after Hank had beaten him, had been prophetic. "Ever since I met you, everything I ever cared about is gone. Ruined, turned to nothing, dead, ever since I hooked up with the great Heisenberg." He had been correct. He simply had not understood how much more Walt would take before the end. Walter White returned to Albuquerque in September of 2010 for a final confrontation with the people who had stolen his money and imprisoned his former partner. Walt had spent months hiding in New Hampshire, isolated and dying, watching his empire collapse through news reports and phone calls. But he had one last play to make. He built a remote-controlled machine gun mounted in the trunk of his vehicle, and he drove to Jack Welker's compound where Jesse remained enslaved. The meeting Walt requested was a deception. When Jack brought Jesse into the clubhouse to demonstrate how thoroughly broken he had become, Walt tackled Jesse to the floor and activated the weapon. The M60 machine gun rotated and fired through the walls, killing everyone in the room except Todd, Jack, and the two men lying on the ground. Walt took a bullet in the abdomen. Jack bled out from his wounds. Todd stood at the window in shock, trying to process the massacre he had just witnessed. Jesse wrapped the chains binding his wrists around Todd's neck. He strangled the man who had executed Andrea, who had tortured him for months, who had threatened to harm a 6-year-old child. Todd's neck snapped. Jesse released the body and stood over it, breathing heavily, covered in blood that was not his own. Walt, dying on the floor, tossed Jesse the keys to his restraints and told him to leave. Jesse drove away from the compound in a vehicle, screaming and crying, finally free, but carrying wounds that would never fully heal. Jesse Pinkman disappeared with the help of a man who specialized in creating new identities for people who needed to vanish completely. He paid nearly $200,000 for documentation, a cover story, and transportation to Haines, Alaska. He became Mr. Driscoll. He left behind everyone he had ever known, every place he had ever lived, every part of his former identity. The authorities searched for him briefly, but his vehicle was found near the Mexican border, suggesting he had fled south. The deception worked. Jesse vanished into a small town where winter lasted most of the year and strangers were uncommon but not unwelcome. The psychological damage remained permanent. Jesse suffered from trauma that manifested in nightmares, flashbacks, and an inability to trust others. He had watched everyone he loved die or suffer because of their connection to him. Jane, Combo, Andrea, Brock's innocence. His own parents had rejected him years before the worst had even begun. The young man who had called himself Captain Cook, who had believed his street intelligence made him untouchable, had learned that intelligence came in forms he never anticipated. The lesson Jesse learned too late was the same lesson that destroyed him. Never underestimate the quiet ones, the desperate ones, the ones who appear weak or afraid or bound by conventional morality. Jesse had dismissed Walter White as a dying teacher, a man too afraid and too conventional to pose any real threat. He had believed that street smarts would always defeat book smarts, that survival skills mattered more than chemistry knowledge, that violence was the only power that mattered in the drug trade. He was wrong about everything. Walt had weaponized trust, loyalty, and love itself. He had turned Jesse's own capacity for caring into a mechanism of control. He had demonstrated that the most dangerous person is not the one who threatens violence, but the one who understands psychology well enough to make you destroy yourself. Jesse had entered a partnership believing he was the experienced one, the one who understood how the game worked. Instead, he had been a student in a class he never knew he was attending, taught by a teacher who viewed him not as a partner, but as a tool to be used and discarded. Jesse Pinkman survived. But survival is not the same as victory. He lives in Alaska under a false name, working with his hands, trying to build something that resembles peace. The man who once had friends, family, girlfriends, and dreams now has only silence and distance. Walter White destroyed Jesse Pinkman without ever laying a hand on him. That is the legacy. That is the warning. Intelligence, when combined with desperation and freed from moral constraint, becomes the most dangerous weapon of all.